Great to see everybody. Thanks for joining our session. This is the Skoll World Forum Ecosystem Day, and this event is hosted by Vera Solutions. We've got a wonderful lineup of speakers joining us today to dig into the topic of integrating portfolio management, risk management, and impact measurement to advance the SDGs. It's been a great forum so far, and we're really excited to help advance the discussion on this topic today. We are recording the session, so just want to make sure that everyone's clear with that and okay with that. My name is Zak Kaufman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vera Solutions. I'll share a little bit more about what we do in a minute, and then I will hand over to the rest of our group here. We've got a wonderful lineup with Maya Winkelstein from the Open Road Alliance, Michael Duggan from Salesforce.org, Eleanor Meyers from Nethope, and Timothy Fives from Attain Partners. So a lot of great perspectives from across the sector, and really excited for this discussion, and a really, I think, timely and important discussion. Particularly when we think about risk management, it's something that we're seeing coming up more and more organizations are really thinking about and looking to strengthen their capacity around risk management, but also in connection, to how they're doing project and program and grant management, as well as how they're doing monitoring and evaluation or impact measurement. So let's dig into it. I'll give a quick intro just as to who Vera is and our work in this space, and then I'll try to set the stage a bit for the topic, and then pass over to the others to introduce themselves, their work, and a few perspectives on the topic. From there, we'll have a group discussion. The chat is open, so we'd love to hear from you. Any reflections, questions, if anything sticks out to you from what folks are saying, we'd love to see that in the chat. We'll be posting a poll in a little bit to make this a bit interactive, so stay tuned. We want to hear about your organizations and your experience, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So this is scheduled to run for an hour. If we need to go over because the discussion is that good, we can maybe go over for a little bit. But without further ado, let's dive on in. So a bit about Vera Solutions. So we are a mission-driven technology company. We like to think of ourselves as a technology partner to social impact organizations working to amplify the impact of the social sector. We've grown to a team of over 90 staff now around the globe. We're on 5 continents. And we're really trying to save social impact organizations time, money, and headaches, drive better accountability, better transparency, and better insight around how we're doing and the impact that we're achieving in the communities that we're all working in. We've worked with over 360 clients since we got started. It's a really diverse portfolio of organizations, implementers, funders, international NGOs, local NGOs. And I think we've had a privilege of really seeing the sector from lots of different angles, and that's enabled us to better serve more and more organizations in the work that we do. Now, we've seen a lot of common patterns and common needs in these organizations, and I would say if we think about the needs in the kind of project and program management space, everything revolves around this cycle of planning, implementation, and then monitoring your projects and programs. And I would say we've seen kind of these three key areas, these intersecting areas coming up over and over again, and really working to deliver solutions in this space. So the first is in what we're labeling kind of portfolio management. So managing your life cycle of projects, programs, or grants, managing the budget and expenditure and cash flow within that program. And again, across this kind of planning, implementation, and monitoring cycle, allocating funding to those programs and managing co-financing, connecting the projects to the geographies and the thematic areas that they might be contributing to, planning out work in the activities or work breakdown structure that you're going to deliver, managing your workforce and the resourcing, who's going to be doing what on your projects. And then procurement planning also we're seeing coming up as part of portfolio management, and you may see other elements in there as well. I mean, it's a little bit different in each organization, but broadly portfolio management sets us up to be able to deliver on a plan that makes sense, on time, on budget, and be accountable to various stakeholders on that front. On the other side of this Venn diagram, you've got impact measurement. So this revolves around many different levels. At the high level, it's indicator management, setting targets, tracking results, being able to see progress from baseline and then over time and across the geographies that you're working in. It also is at a local or more granular level, tracking reach, tracking program participation, tracking outcomes. So, whether that's through surveys or narrative assessments, whether you're doing more qualitative data through focus groups and interviews, gathering feedback, whether you're doing quantitative outcome evaluations, obviously just, looking at the organizations here, there's a lot of diversity in the needs of impact measurement. But we have seen a pretty strong common denominator in terms of these being the high level sort of functions or capacity areas and needs, whether we're talking about, kind of the actual day-to-day work, or we're talking about solutions or technologies to kind of meet those needs. And then the third area here is risk management. So identifying and classifying risks, monitoring and assessing risks over time, taking action to mitigate risks and respond to incidents or events that occur, and then prioritizing, escalating. There's lots of other kind of lenses. I'll let Maya, who's got far more expertise in risk management than I do, unpack that area in just a minute. But there's some interesting intersections in these areas. You've got results frameworks that we're seeing more and more organizations taking an interest in result-based management. So you then kind of set up results frameworks or log frames at the intersection of how you're going to be tracking your impact on one hand, and how you're actually planning your work, how you're budgeting for programs on the other hand. And then as risk management intersects with each of these, you have delivery risks or programming risks, and then you've got impact risks as well. And we'll unpack that a bit in the session today. At Vera, because we've seen this common denominator, we've actually built out we've gotten sick of building the same thing over and over for organizations. We built out a solution called AMP Impact, which is a native Salesforce-based solution that any organization can adopt. And really brings together these different functional areas, provides a really great framework for being able to drive stronger portfolio management, impact measurement, and risk management. We can talk more about it later if folks want to, but really we want to focus on this broader concept of what does it take to kind of bring these functions together, as often they're very siloed within organizations, and we're seeing lots of organizations seeking to bring them together and to strengthen capacity in these areas. So hopefully that helps set the stage for the discussion today. And what we want to do is share we've got a poll. So I'll just share a link to the poll, and we'd like to do a little bit of a self-assessment to see how your organization is doing in each of these areas. So the first question is to self-assess on how you're doing in terms of your portfolio management capacity. And the second question is going to be around your impact measurement capacity. The third around your risk management capacity. So the poll should look something like that. And hopefully you can take a moment and vote on that. It'll open in a browser. And I'll progress it to the next question in just a second here. Let me pause my screen sharing. Pause it. All right, and we'll just progress it to the next question. Next one. So how would you rate your capacity in terms of impact measurement? Looks like we've got a number of votes coming in. Keep them coming. Great, I'll leave that up for another 30 seconds. All right, we've got some very strong, we got some weak, we've got a bit of a spread here. And we'll throw up the last question. How would you rate your capacity in terms of impact measurement? All right, yeah. We got one organization who's very strong. Maybe that's one of our speakers. We'll see. Cool. Okay, so we're seeing a really interesting spread across these. And let's see if I'm going to stop our poll now. I think we've got our votes. So we'll come back and share these. And while I'm pulling that all together, I want to pass the mic over to Maya to introduce herself, Open Road Alliance, and really help kind of set the stage for the current state of risk management in the sector. So over to you, Maya.
Thank you, Zach, and it's great to be here with you and everybody else. Thanks everyone for joining today. Glad to be back virtually at Skoll. As Zach mentioned, I'm the CEO of Open Road Alliance. We are a impact investor, grant maker, and advocate in the sector for 10 years now. And risk has really been at the center of a lot of what we do. As a shortcut, the capital that we provide, both our loan portfolio and our grant portfolio, for 10 years now, we've exclusively engaged in moments where organizations are otherwise fully funded and then something happens. Because as we know, the world is unpredictable and the social sector is actually not immune to that unpredictability. And yet, the way that so much of philanthropic and impact finance is structured, it's not structured to deal with that unpredictability. So often, what might otherwise be a minor hiccup can really have significant negative impact effects. So Open Road has, really developed a specialty from an investment standpoint of coming in with the right capital at the right time to help organizations overcome those obstacles. And in doing that work, we've really gained a bird's eye view in empirically what actually goes wrong, or in vocabulary that's relevant for today's conversation, what are the risks that get realized, which then carry the potential to derail impact. And if you're kind of wondering what that is, we've also collected this data over the past 10 years, and here it is. Empirically, if you want to know, what derails impact, this is pretty much it. Now, this data, if you were to update this data is 24 months old. If you were to update it, the little triangle in the acts of God, that's public health crisis, would grow about tenfold thanks to COVID as a black swan event. But, I think that the main point here is that, things do go wrong all the time. And if you think about the risks that organizations face, this gives you a pretty good smattering. And of course, it's, can't be ignored that the largest percentage here are created by our own industry. So it's actually typically not the acts of God and the global pandemics that we have to worry about. It's also not the fraud, the theft, the embezzlement, the things that our lawyers are typically very focused on, or our compliance officers may be very focused on. It's these other risks that connect to that larger project cycle that Zak was sharing around implementation risk, strategy risk, and impact risk. Next slide, please. And yet, we also have done the research over the years to say, okay, well, if we know that this happens, and here's what is happening, what are folks doing about it? What are foundations doing about it? And what are implementers doing about it? And as this data shows, this is from a survey that we conducted with over 400 funders and implementers. Really, the state of risk management is don't ask, don't tell. Funders don't ask what could go wrong. Grantees or potential grantees don't, if they are thinking about it internally, they're certainly not sharing that information with their funders. Funders don't budget for it. Grantees don't budget for it. In a sense, that's why Open Road exists. But there's certainly a question to whether we should have to, or whether it would be more efficient if there was more accounting for risk in the budgeting process. Then, again, 65% of organizations have no policy. And again, this is specifically for funders, but, in the event where a grantee does run into a risk realized, if you will, and comes back and says, hey, to complete the project as planned, we now need another 10% or 5% of the original grant making budget to do these things. Funders have no policy for that. There's no process, there's no criteria, there's no decision-making protocols. And what all of this means is that typically, and those of you who are implementers on this call know this from firsthand experience, risk becomes something that you don't talk about. If you do assess it internally, you don't share it, that information with your funders. And when something does happen, rather than fixing the problem, learning from it, putting that into that impact continuous learning improvement cycle that Zak shared, it becomes something that we either sweep under the rug, or we pull out the duct tape, we don't quite address it. And really, at the end of the day, what's lost is our effectiveness as a sector and therefore impact. So that's just a little bit about the state of risk management and to set the conversation today. Zach, back to you.
That's great. Thanks, Maya. And I mean, looking at the results from the survey, it was pretty clear risk management out of the three was the area that I think came up the weakest. I mean, you have any kind of quick reflections on capacity around risk management in the sector? I mean, curious, just any quick thoughts on that?
Yes, it's, I mean, sort of as that last slide showed, the capacity is really, it's not there. And what we, have learned over the years and hypothesized is that it's not there for a few reasons. One is it's simply not something that our sector has ever been good about thinking about at all. Some of this comes down to just a lack of understanding about what risk actually is. In fact, sometimes I'll say that, risk today is where impact was 10 or 15 years ago. So we're using the word, but there isn't actually a common understanding or sophisticated measurement system on the difference, for example, between an output, an outcome, and impact. Risk has a similar framework. And so there's the lack of capacity, I think, comes from just the lack of understanding and knowledge. And then also comes from this don't ask, don't tell. If funders aren't asking for something, it's very hard for nonprofits to even that want to do it, to have the capacity, dedicate the resources necessary to doing it. So I think that's a big part of the piece as well.
Super. Yeah, really, really helpful. I mean, it's I think COVID has helped shine a spotlight on the importance of this in a very large way. But I like the analogy to where impact measurement was 10, 15 years ago, right? It was you're kind of aware you need to be investing in and aware you need to be building capacity, perhaps, but there's a lot of work to do. Let me bring Michael into the conversation. So Michael, I'll spotlight you here. Michael, would love to kind of pick up the conversation. Would love to hear your perspective here. I know you're not just coming from Salesforce.org, but actually
Sure.
decades of experience in the humanitarian international development sector. And over to you.
1 decade. Thank you, Zach.
Fair enough. Okay.
Michael Duggan. I'm with Salesforce.org, which is Salesforce's Center of Excellence for Social Engagement and focusing on partnering with the global community of change makers out there. Before Salesforce, I worked for about a decade in the humanitarian sector, and I was on the leadership teams of Oxfam International and Caritas Ireland. So both of those being global humanitarian organizations. And in both of those, I was heavily invested in driving out portfolio management and impact measurement. That was the key need. That was the key transformation over the last decade. But I also worked very closely with the finance people, the chief operating officers, and really risk management, became a very substantial part of my role. Internally, the risk of not being able to deliver our own internal change, but also mainstreaming that in terms of how we actually delivered risk management in an increasingly complex world and with increasing regulatory pressure. I also rolled out a global safeguarding case management capability for Oxfam International across 92 countries. And ultimately that was a risk management process that we had to do and that many other nonprofits are in the midst of doing. So I became very, very familiar there. And I also became very obvious to me that these processes were highly fragmented within the organizations. And it was a real struggle to try and align and integrate those processes to give leadership boards and critically stakeholders a holistic view of how we were delivering our programs, in a safe, managed risk way. I do feel though, before we continue the conversation, I've been in the field enough, and I've worked with enough country directors and program and directors and regional directors. I've seen some amazing risk management in some of the most complex scenarios in the world. In very complex countries, in very complex regions. I've seen some amazing examples of individuals managing risk within their territories. I think it's important to say that nonprofits do operate in some of the most challenging environments in the world, and I just genuinely think we should applaud them for what they've done. I absolutely agree with Maya that we need to get better at systemizing it, but there is some amazing work that's been done out there at the moment. And we can see that now with the Ukraine crisis, where, you know, a black swan event that was in nobody's risk register 3 years ago, and the ability to pivot to that agility. So I think it's important that we reflect on that. There are, you know, certainly some great practices out there and some great capabilities.
Super. Thanks, Michael. We'll pass over to Eleanor. And again, Eleanor, would love to, you know, get a bit of introduction to your background and interest in the topic. Obviously now, you know, working with Nethope, so getting to see these not just risk management, but these capacities, areas of capacity across many, you know, humanitarian organizations. So yeah, we'd love to hear your take on this. And just a reminder to all, you know, the chat is open. If you like a topic or you want to dig into something, feel free to pop a question or a comment into the chat feed. All right, Eleanor, over to you.
Great, thanks, Zach. And yeah, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity here. So I had kind of 2 careers, but in the last 2 years, I just kind of worked inside Nethope primarily because I had to fill in as the COO for about 2 years. And I just stepped back into a senior consultant role right now and leading a impact data working group at Nethope, working with some members. But after kind of working in a very large NGO World Vision for 10 years, and then a Swiss-based humanitarian organization for 3 years before I started freelancing in this sector, what I learned is it's kind of a combination of what Michael and Maya said, right? Yes, there is risk management within organizations, but a lot of times we try to contain that internally. You know, let's not expose this, because like we're in the sector of dealing with this, and therefore we just cope with this, and the struggle to kind of handle that, I think partly because you are not given the room, perhaps, you know, to really account for that contingency. Therefore, what I have seen both in the organizations that I have worked and also in the member organizations at Nethope, that is happening a lot. And Nethope, just for those who don't know, you know, is a consortium of NGOs. So it's an NGO of NGOs as well. So it does its own programs, and it also works with 65 members to try to multiply impact. You know, so Nethope as an organization is trying to kind of see how we as a sector can work better together, share problems and share challenges and solve for them. So, you know, when this topic of risk management comes up, it just kind of caused me to reflect back on my first career, which is in investment banking. And I think if you work in the financial sector, every organization has a big risk management department. Why? Because they acknowledge, they know that there are risks, you know, and it is not something that we need to hide, because sometimes you lose money. And in the financial sector, we talk about losing money. So what does that translate to in the social sector, right? In the for-profit, in the nonprofit? It's like we try to deliver impact. That's how we measure our success, right? So if we see that there are risks of potentially producing less impact, why is it that we don't kind of do the risk management and monitor that more? I think that's a question that we certainly don't have the answer to. Nethope has a lot of focus on that either, just because really the sector has not focused on that when we focus on the work part of it. So I think it's a very relevant topic.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Eleanor. And I mean, interesting, again, coming back to that analogy, or the analogy to where impact measurement was 10 to 15 years ago, right? I think some of it really needs to come to some extent from funders and you know, push to be open about this, right? I think, you know, from the data that Maya shared earlier, is a little bit daunting in terms of the lack of folks asking about it and the openness around this. So yeah, great insights. Let's hand over to Tim. And Tim, would be great to bring your perspective into here. Obviously, you bring a wealth of experience from your time at Catholic Relief Services, now at Attain Partners, getting to work with, you know, with many other organizations and, you know, supporting their efforts to strengthen, you know, programs and data management technology. Yeah, what have you kind of seen at the intersection of these three areas, and how do we get to a better place?
Yeah, well, that's the magic question, right? So just quick introduction. Thank you for having me today. So as Zach said, I was formerly at CRS, and if you looked at Zach's Venn diagram that he had up earlier, we really focused on the right and left side of that, which was the program management aspect, and the looking at the results of that throughout the build of our CRM, which I was responsible for. And that whole discussion about risk on the bottom is there's so many parallels between driving, how you're measuring results in the field, and how are you getting that information and that historic information to make forward-looking decisions. And that paradigm is the same for risk management. You're collecting the information, you know what the risks are, and I think there's a real opportunity for NGOs to get out in front of it, articulate the potentiality of risks with their programs and within their organization, instead of just brushing it under the rug, keeping it internally as it's done. So I think going forward, it's the how do you build the program and the awareness internally that this is a good thing to be able to communicate about it. And from my experience driving the implementation at CRS, a lot of it is the internal change management within the organization to think differently about risk and
Awesome. Cool. So let me bring up the group as a whole here, and we can get some interplay, get a little discussion going. So Maya, maybe we can bring it back to you. I mean, reflections on some of the topics that have been raised here. Clearly there's some, I think a few people kind of building on your parallel with impact measurement. Yeah, do you want to expand on any of these?
Sure. I mean, I echo all of the comments of my fellow panelists, and I think, everybody's comments build on each other and all agreement. I think a couple of things that stand out to me that I think is, helpful to kind of build upon in thinking about this. One is what Eleanor said about, some of the similarities or dissimilarities to the financial sector. Right. And I do think, and this sort of builds on Michael's comment too, that there are some practices out there that we can build on. Right. The good news is, we're not actually starting from scratch. There are things out there. There are some organizations that do this very well. It's just about finding it and sharing it and then replicating it. But I do think that, before you can really dive in, we still have this fundamental understanding or misunderstanding of what risk is and what risk is for our sector, right? As opposed to for hedge funds or the, financial sector. And on that, the two things I would just offer quickly. One, again, not to make this too boring, but in talking about risk, it's just important to understand the definition. And the trick answer here is that there's actually two definitions of risk. There's risk as a noun, which is a risk, and it's objective, right? It's what we've been talking about. The world is uncertain, things go wrong, there are pandemics, there are changes in funder timelines, there are water pipes that burst in your office and flood it, right? Things happen, and that is objective risk. There's also risk as a verb, to risk, i.e., it's too risky to invest in, or is that too risky for us? And that is actually a completely subjective frame of discussing risk. It speaks to our risk appetite, our risk tolerance, which is something, again, completely subjective. So I just encourage us as we're moving through that conversation for everyone to keep that distinction in mind, because if you think something is risky or not risky, that actually has no bearing on what the actual objective real world risks might or might not be. And that distinction, I think, is important. And if you keep it in mind, it'll save a lot of confusion. So that's number one. Number two is then, what risks do we care about in our sector? And I'll say, we've had conversations with, billion-dollar foundations who absolutely, they have risk managers and risk officers, and they're like, oh yeah, we have very comprehensive risk management systems. And then you say, okay, great. Well, what risks are those measuring? Well, they're measuring, it's, through our compliance team. It's legal, it's tax, it's financial, and it's reputational. Okay, those things are important, but it's not impact, right? As many of my fellow panelists have spoken to, where are you measuring risks to being able to achieve the impact that in theory you exist for? And it's that area of risk management and measurement that I think, is woefully behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And something we're starting to see some of our clients, as they're building out their results frameworks and digitizing them, kind of getting them off of Excel, getting them into better relational databases, better, tools like AMP Impact, that they want to not just set up, here's the log frame, don't touch it, it's static, right? But actually unpack the results or the outcomes, the outputs, to be able to say, okay, well, here's some risks we've identified, to achieving this output or achieving this outcome. Here's the probability or the likelihood, that this risk is going to occur 1 to 5. Here's the probability or the impact it would have, right? 1 to 5, and be able to drive, a more, more sophisticated conversation in the organization around, like, what are the odds that we're actually going to be able to achieve the outcomes we're shooting for. Eleanor, maybe we can bring in your perspective here. I mean, there's some parallels to, you mentioned kind of the impact data working group, and I imagine one of the challenges there is just getting to alignment around, like, what do we mean, right? Like, what is the, what are the definitions, and what's the term? What is there an aligned set of terminology that we can start from in the sector?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And in fact, I just came from the impact data working group at Nethope, and this is a group that the members are mostly M&E experts, and then also from the IT side of the house as well, because it's like, even when Maya mentioned that, yeah, maybe impact data was here 15 years ago, but you know what, even now, right, very large NGOs are still struggling to see how we can capture and share impact data across the organization. How do we make decision within an organization? And in the sector, there is still what do we mean by impact, right? What do we mean by risk? And so I think one of the things that Nethope has learned is that if members come together, if nonprofits come together, if we talk about this and then try to come up with some framework, maybe we can use the same kind of similar framework. What do you mean by risk in affecting our impact, and be more open in talking about that together, then hopefully our funders will also understand it, and also the general public, right? Like, we're doing this to serve the beneficiaries. Ultimately, the impact is how they feel they're being impacted. It's not just what we say we are doing to them, right? It's more from the beneficiaries' perspective. What are the impacts? And if we as nonprofits do not deliver, how is it going to affect them, right? So we look at that together. Then what are the ways that we can, as a sector, both as funders and as kind of program developers, implementers, how do we look at it more holistically, so that in the end, those we strive to serve have kind of real changes, positive impact in their lives, right? Because that's what we strive for together.
Amen. Michael, I saw you nodding a bit there.
Always nodding. Yeah, look, to reflect both Maya and Eleanor, like from my experience having worked in these organizations, I mean, I still remember an initial attempt at developing a global risk register ending in absolute chaos, because we were trying to essentially get 20 different countries to agree on, going back to what the subjective part of it was incredibly challenging, and we weren't even on agreement on the objective side. So if we start giving some practical advice here, like the first thing is your board and leadership team need to sit down and agree what they mean by risk management, and do capacity building. And there's quite a few, both consultants and organizations working in this space. And actually, in all probability, your audit firm will provide this pro bono to you, to get you on board, because it's in their interests as well to get that core basic understanding of what risk management means. The other part that I'm very exercised on, which was also a much bigger challenge than me, than getting people, I suppose, on the same page, and the technical part of delivering, risk management, was the cultural aspect of it. And frankly, in my mind, this is the biggest challenge in the sector. And I think, often we see it's very unfair that both the public sector and the nonprofit sector are held up as examples of poor risk management, when actually the reality is that both those sectors are held to account when they fail very publicly, because they tend to be regulated, or they have to appear in front of, committees in Parliament. Private sector companies, aren't that great on risk management, but they don't have to share that publicly. And I think, one of the challenges, particularly for those brands that need to demonstrate to the public almost this infallible capability of delivering programs in some of the most challenging, scenarios that you can imagine, or just generally, even domestic programming, just quite risky. We need to have an honest conversation with the public, and we especially need to have an honest conversation with the funders. But we also need to see from our own leadership in the sector, an acceptance that risks will occur, and that we should talk about them openly. And this is quite a personal one for me, given, I was in the midst of the safeguarding crisis. The reality is we knew there was a problem in the sector, but we just weren't really willing to talk about it, because we thought, well, if the risk is realized, then it'll be very damaging to the sector and to our organization. And that happens anyway. So the sooner we kind of address that kind of cultural challenge within the sector, the better. I'll also land on just one last point, which I think is quite important. Risk for me is something that everybody in the organization needs to participate in. Eleanor gave an example of the financial services sector, and I just think a really interesting piece of research was done back in the early 2000s. The financial services sector started recruiting chief risk officers, and there was one person that was in charge of risk, and the idea was that will make us less risky. As we discovered in the 2008 subprime crisis, nothing of the sort occurred. In fact, the academic evidence is people within the banks took greater risks because they thought it was somebody else's job. So how we get, as part of this culture change, that everybody embraces risk management as part of their role, I think is really important.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I was gonna say, it seems like we're in a way we're kind of dancing around this, but a lot of what we're talking about here is a need to change the culture in the sector towards one that's more open and honest, in recognizing, hey, it's not easy to talk about these things, even internally. Certainly not easy to talk about them externally. But
can I just add to that, we only started after the largest crisis in the sector around safeguarding. We only started to meet and talk about safeguarding and the crisis. And it took a convening of funders and nonprofits, and some like Oxfam had to step forward into that space because they were in that space in order to shift the conversation on. And that will be kind of where I'd really land, and how challenging it is to talk about this. And we can only learn when we're talking about things.
100%. And I mean, that sort of brings my next question was actually, what can we learn from the last decade where we have seen examples of culture change? Like, what can we kind of pinpoint areas where we have seen the sector kind of recognize, hey, we're not good enough at, this, or we're not open enough about that, and to address it. Safeguarding, I think, being an interesting area. That's kind of an open question to the rest of the group. Have you seen other examples?
Sorry, Maya.
Go ahead, Maya.
No, I'm sure. I'm curious, Michael, your thought on it. Go first.
Well, Maya, I'm gonna play off. You said that kind of really restrictive view of risk that a lot of organizations have, and one of the ones that we don't talk about in our sector as well is our own people. We've seen things talk about the Great Resignation, but the nonprofit sector has not been great at managing the risk around burnout in the sector, around attracting and retaining talent. And we've seen a number, particularly in Europe, we've seen a number of cases, opening around, the fact is you have a duty of care to your employees and your volunteers. And this is a space that's very, very immature, to my mind, in terms of developing a strong risk management in that space. And by the way, the need for that is in order to trigger those conversations with funders to say, actually, this isn't good enough that we're relying, on our staff burning themselves out to deliver in very challenging, under-resourced, austere, circumstances. So I think that's one of the ones that's playing out at the moment. And I think that really brings it to home how challenging that discussion can be. But I'm sure others have great examples.
No, I think you're right. I agree with that, Michael. Duty of care is one of the areas that has not been managed well from a risk perspective. But Zach, to your question of like, how do you change the conversation and how do you get that culture shift started? My graduate studies, I'm a student of international politics, international relations and theory. So anybody who has gone through those IR courses and done game theory and all of those fun things, power. Right? I'm sorry, but power is a big force, and we all recognize who holds the power in the relationships in our sector, and for better or worse. And it's a different topic of conversation, but I would say I'm on the side of for worse. But the fact still is that funders, those who have the funds, whether it is private, whether it is corporate, whether it is government, right? That is where the power comes, the incentives comes, the rules of the game are dictated by, right? Those with the power. And so that's where, I do think, yes, in the perfect world and in the ideal world, in a relationship, both sides you can only ever go halfway. You can only meet someone halfway. The other side of the relationship has to come half. So there is work to be done on the nonprofit side. Nonprofits, it would be great for me to sit up here and say, and, be brave, speak about risks, bring it up with your funders, initiate the conversation, just start doing the work. I'm also aware that to meet your funders halfway, it's so much easier to do that when it is the funder or whoever it is in the relationship that has the power to take the first step, to ask, to have their own conversation about what their risk tolerance is, and to have those conversations in a really open and transparent way. Because here's the other secret about risk. A conversation about your subjective side of risk, your risk tolerance, what you think is risky, what you think isn't risky, what you think is too risky, what is worth taking the risk, what is not worth taking the risk. Having an open, honest conversation about that is not just going to reveal your risk tolerance and appetite and your risk profile, it's going to reveal your implicit biases. It's going to reveal the underlying value set that you're using to make decisions as an organization. Risk management, I think, does often get so segmented into either a legal compliance thing that, again, like my panelists said, somebody else's job, I don't have to worry about that, compartmentalized thing, and or just this like wonky kind of like impact measurement has also gone through its cycles of, it's just that wonky thing over there, versus it really is an integral part of the values and the culture of an organization and how it expresses itself.
You need to get a bit more mainstream. A lot of really good insights there. So pop over to Eleanor. I know this concept of power and kind of what's needed from funders is is something that comes up quite a bit in Nethope. And one of the things I love about the Skoll Forum is we get a mix of, funders and implementers and, capacity builders and service providers kind of all in the audience. And we can have these kinds of important and candid conversations around how we need to, as a group, change and challenge ourselves. Eleanor.
Yeah, most definitely, because I think the power dynamic is so important, right? And back to what Michael was saying, like, why do we have so much burnout in the sector, right? Because I think when people enter the development nonprofit sector, there's almost this kind of implicit expectation that, well, yeah, you're going to work really hard to do your best to just like help other people, right? Like there's this kind of self-sacrificing nature culture in the sector. And therefore, when something unexpected happens, then you say, well, I have to deal with it. I'll just work harder. Oh, we don't have enough funding. Well, we're not going to tell the funder because they expect us to deliver. But I think that accountability and transparency really goes hand in hand, right? Like if you cannot be completely transparent, how can you truly be held accountable for what you're promising to deliver, right? Like I think when funders and implementers can have that conversation upfront. And I think it's the upfront part that is also harder. Like, if we need to create a log frame now, every single time we do a program, why is it that we cannot kind of look at the risk in a better way and kind of measure that and monitor that, just like we measured the result? If we can start doing that as we start a program, then there will be more ability to have the ongoing conversation. And honestly, I mean, the sector, both the implementers and the funders should learn hand in hand, right? Nobody knows everything yet. Can we just work together? And if we have the use of technology to help us kind of be more open about that, I think in the end, then everyone wins, right? Because it makes it easier. And that's kind of when I hope certainly see as members, if we can come together and talk about it more, or if we come to forums like this and some of the things that the resources that you have, Maya, why don't we share that more openly, right? Because if we share more, then we can do better together.
Amen. So I want to come back to the technology piece and bring Tim in a sec. But Maya, I know you guys have an online course, if I'm not mistaken, that you've launched. Might be a relevant time to give that a quick plug from. There we go.
Yeah, thanks. I just dropped the link into the chat for those that have access to it. So we partnered with Candid last year to basically share everything that we've learned about risk management and risk and philanthropy over the last decade to create a free self-directed online e-learning course. It's basically Risk 101. It lives on Candid's learning platform for posterity, but the link's in the chat. So, feel free if you want to learn more to go there and go through it. But thank you, Eleanor. Thanks for the segue.
Tim, I mean, we're hearing about culture change. We're hearing a bit about how this function is too siloed. Eleanor brought up the need for technology solutions and the role they could play. Maybe you want to hit on one of those areas.
Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind is turning this whole discussion into an empowerment tool, right? So if you have a good framework for management of risks, that then becomes an asset for the organization, right? I think that's the fundamental change that we need in these organizations to continue to push forward. And then it's, when you go to your funders and your teams, it's only a risk until it happens, right? So if you have a good framework for the management of that risk and having early indicators, early warning flags that come up, now you can start to manage the response to that risk proactively versus having a reactive in some cases. So you see a lot of that as part of the similarities with looking at results. How do you get the right data from the field into the systems? How do you connect this so you can use that historical data to make determinations on what's potentially coming in the future, good or bad? And so one of the fundamental things that we looked at, especially when we did implementation at CRS, it's not a technology issue. It is a people issue first, right? Changing the culture within the organization. And that's where organizations, I think, miss that. It's like, oh, well, let me just throw some technology at it and we've solved it. And yes, that's part of it, but the main part is changing how people are thinking about this in the first place, and taking it out of the closet and putting it into the forefront, and changing the attitude as this is an asset for our organization now because we have a
Yeah, great insight. I mean, as this is sort of a burgeoning area and seems to be an area where funders and, I mean, it's where, even international NGOs that might be subgranting to smaller organizations or seeking out implementation partners, being able to show or signal that you've got some strength, you've got some capacity in this area. I like what you said there, Tim, that it could be a real asset. Michael, you look like you want to comment on that. And I dropped in the chat another poll, a couple more questions kind of coming up from the conversation. Would be great to hear the attendees' voice on some of these topics.
Just like one more thing before moving.
Sure.
One of the things that, in CRS's case, they had a really good framework for managing the risk on the dollars and cents, and with some of those partners and doing audits and things. So depending on the organization, there already is kind of this baseline foundation to build in some cases. So I think in one sense, I'm a little bit bipolar. We're way far away from being able to do this. On the other hand, we may not be as far away with the ability to share the information with the folks that are on this call to build that out pretty rapidly. So, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on both Eleanor and Timothy's point, though, as just maybe just stating the obvious. Most of the risks that we identify, we accept. So from a global CIO perspective, what I tend to spend, why I was so involved in it, is around controls. And the reality is controls are expensive. And this is where perhaps there's also reluctance to have a discussion, because the reality is if you're working with vulnerable people, well then you've got a safeguarding risk. Plainly, you need to put in controls for that. Putting in those controls can be quite expensive. And these are not costs that can be easily allocated to programs, by the way. A lot of them are kind of centralized costs, just being. And this is, again, an area where we have to have those honest discussions. Some other sectors will put a percentage, of revenue against implementing those controls. And I do think it's quite important, that whilst risk management is super important, let's not lose sight of the fact that the reality out of most of these conversations will land on, we need to invest in controls, and where are the resources going to come for those controls.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely important lens to apply here, right? Like if this isn't gonna, the capacity, the systems to do this, the funding to do it isn't going to come out of thin air, right? So if we want to get serious about it, it's going to require investment of time. It's going to require investment of resources. So we got about 5 minutes left, and reminder to if anybody wants to drop any questions or reflections, comments in the chat, please do that. We'll go kind of around the horn for a few kind of final thoughts. Maya, maybe we can start with you. Any kind of reflections or takeaways for you from this conversation as you're out, championing better risk management in the social sector?
Yeah, I maybe will just echo Michael's last comment in saying, another element of this is right sizing, right? Just like we've learned over the years with impact measurement. Not everybody should be doing an RCT or 26 log frames. So right sizing is, and again, I just quick thing, one of those things that we can also just learn from, not repeat our mistakes and replicate the wheel. With that, I think the final thing I would say is, hopefully from this conversation you took away, if you didn't already come with this, that risk management is important. It's probably lacking, and something else needs to be done, right? There's more to, like, oh my gosh, I need to do. What I also would hope that our listeners take away from this conversation, though, and what I do want to emphasize is you don't have to be at the PhD level to start, right? Again, like developing an impact measurement program or developing a monitoring, learning, and evaluation program, you don't have to start at the graduate level. Just start. That's the most important thing to do. So whether it's, making sure that this is an agenda item on your next board meeting and that you have that basic conversation about risk, whether it's, encouraging your staff for professional development to do the Candid course so everybody has the same vocabulary moving forward, or whether it's just starting with that basic prioritization that Michael was talking about of saying, okay, at our next retreat, we're going to take 2 hours and we're going to spend the first hour and throw everything up on the whiteboard. And then we're going to spend the second hour actually just thinking about, well, which ones do we really need to worry about? Because frankly, the only things we need to worry about are the things that are either going to be really harmful if they happen, and or beyond that, the only ones that are likely to happen. If it's a 0.01% chance of happening, maybe we don't put our time and effort there. Maybe we do, right? That's the balance between how much harm would it cause versus that. But just starting something somewhere is something that you can do, and that's better than nothing at all.
Awesome. So you don't have to start at the PhD level. Just start small. Don't be afraid to start small. On the poll that we had here, we've seen 100% of folks said that they thought that funders should be asking applicants that would like to identify key risks to achieving the impact in the projects that they're proposing. So that's an interesting takeaway, jived against the initial 76% don't ask. So hopefully funders that are listening in can take a little something away from that. And I think to this last point, about 75% it looks like agreed or strongly agreed that their organization needs to be investing in building strengthening systems or capacity around risk management. So certainly look to Maya and team. Check out the course if you're looking to explore that. Let's go to Eleanor. Final thoughts, takeaways for before we wrap.
Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of time, but just like echo what Maya has already said. And whether you are a very large nonprofit or a very small one, you can start somewhere. So that's really important in the sharing part. And if funders can encourage that, that would help the sector move forward. That's all I want to add.
Amen. And certainly if you're interested in exploring this a little bit more, if we can be helpful at Vera, the team at Attain Partners can be helpful. Don't hesitate to reach out. Tim, final thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I love that. Start small, right? And start with the human element of it, right? Everybody can start that, and we're going to roll it up and colleagues here start having those discussions. Because technology, while it's an enabler for this, the mindsets of the organization need to change on how you're managing risk, and I think that's just starting those conversations internally is what's required. So look at how a framework can enable and be an asset for your organization.
Anna says here in the chat, cultivating a risk transparent culture goes hand in hand with cultivating a learning culture, being open about recognizing and talking about failure. I love that. Michael, final thought from your side?
Very quickly, often when I get asked about risk in a digital age, everyone thinks cybersecurity, but I'd also just think about upside risk. We saw with the Ice Bucket Challenge how quickly something could scale on the fundraising side. And upside risk is actually a challenge in digital programming. No longer are you in an analog world where you've got a limit to how quickly you can expand your program. So think potentially about upside risk, and it also gets you to reframe how you think about risk within your organization.
That's a great positive note to end on, Michael. And I want to give a big thanks to Maya, Michael, Eleanor, and Tim for sharing all this wisdom. Thanks to everybody for making the time to join. I think we've had a really interesting conversation around capacity, around culture change, around the role technology can play in strengthening our processes and building a bit more capacity in organizations. Maybe how funders and the relationship between funders and implementers needs to evolve if we're going to get serious about risk management as a sector. So thanks everybody for participating and joining. Happy Skoll Ecosystem Day, and enjoy the rest of the day further. we'll stick around if anybody wants to chat a little bit. We'll stop recording and keep the room open if anybody wants to have a little mingle afterwards. But otherwise, have a great rest of the day, everybody, and thanks.